Hey everybody, just a quick note before the video begins. If you like the video or learn anything, please hit the like and subscribe button. Nothing bad will happen to you. Just like everybody else on YouTube, it'd be fun to make a buck. Thanks. Today I'm going to be showing you how to form up for a curved concrete countertop. I'm in North Idaho working on a project, a little man cave for my buddy, building him a kitchen. And we're going to work on this island surface, and if you pan back you can see what I've done here is created a little curve in the island, and we're going to build a concrete countertop with an eating area that follows the curve of the island. This is a plywood template that I have cut out just to give me a rough idea of what the countertop size is going to be, and I will actually be cutting it down and using it as part of my form that I will show you a little later. So let's get started. The next step is I brought my plywood template outside and I've laid it on top of a 3/4 inch piece of melamine that is going to take up part of the form for the overhang. So we'll just trace this with a pencil around. For the cutout lines, and on the end I decided, instead of a square cut, that I'm going to make a smaller radius at this end, and for that I'll just kind of use a bendy board like so to the curve I like, and I'll get someone to help me hold the board and draw that in with a pencil. And while I'm here, I'm also going to mark the center hole of my radius with a little drill, and I'll show you why that's going to help me cut out. The next thing we're going to do is cut out the melamine, and we'll start with the radius. And the absolute best way to cut a radius is always with a router, but I forgot to pack the router in the truck. So what I've done is made a jig for my jigsaw, and it works pretty well. And now you'll see the hole that I transferred through with the drill on the center one marks the hole for the center of the radius. So we'll just screw it in with a screw. That way it's allowed to move freely. With your jigsaw, put a fresh new blade on there. You don't want an old blade with any sort of a bend to it because it'll fight against you on the jig. Side note, when you're making a jig, if you make a jig like this, just make sure to measure where your blade is and it lines up with the center of your radius where you put your screw hole. Well, that'll keep the radius true. So, put on a little eye protection and ear protection and start to make the cut. All the cuts done with the jigsaw, the radius, and we'll finish the straight cut with a skill saw. With the melamine template cut out, we take it off the sawhorses and put the original plywood template back on, and I flipped it over. So the underside of this template now, what I've done when it was on the island, I traced the overhang part and I used a 1-inch block. So I've got this cut to make now, which is going to be the inner part of my form. So I'll cut it out. And want to keep this scrap of what you've cut out for your kids' grade school play. It's a big question mark. Always a keeper. Okay, so this is the piece of plywood that is the shape of the island, and we've put the countertop melamine back on the sawhorses. Now we're going to lay this one back on the overhang template, and we match up this corner and make sure it matches up perfectly, which it does. There, and we will trace this with pencil and cut it out. Is I've taken the melamine sheet and I've placed it on top of the plywood sheet that was tacked to the countertop, and I've got a 1-inch overhang on this side. This is my dog Millie, she's helping, and we're going to trace the plywood around the melamine countertop. On the sawhorses, and we've got the white melamine top flipped over, and you can see where we traced it around the bottom. Now here's the important step, is we don't want to cut out the overhang form on our trace line. We want to go back 1.5 inches, because that's what our overhang was on our piece of plywood. So you can take a little spacer block. I'm going to trace this line up, but for the curve I just take the spacer block and I follow along the curved line, and it doesn't have to be precise, and that's the way we find. It's always a good idea then to squiggle out the line you don't want to cut, so you don't end up cutting the wrong line. Okay, another little trick I'll show you for drawing a straight line here, it's an old drywall trick, is to just run your tape measure and use it as a straight edge, and transfers the line. Back to the inside of the project, what I have done is taken the plywood part of the form and have screwed it down to the island and brought in the curved drop part of the overhang form, the 3/4 inch melamine, and you can see I've already pre-drilled and just hand tightened some screws in here, so when we flip it over and screw it to the underside, it will make that easier. Here's a note. Here's a tapered countersink bit. It's really handy to have one of these for screwing things down, getting a nice bite, and getting a nice tight fit between your forms, just to make everything fit fine. So I'm going to pick this up, swing it around, and my cameraman woman is going to have to give me a hand placing this. Holding one end. Main drop part of the form flipped over, and now with the help of my steady camera woman, we'll put it underneath the plywood form. Pop it into place there, and I'll put some screws in the bottom to hold it up. There we go. I'll put the screws in nice and tight. It snugs it right up. The drop form melamine is now screwed together, and you can kind of start to see it all as a whole here. For the overhang, this is the part of the form that will eventually drop away, and it'll just be countertop. The wood will remain. If you come around, you can see the form is together. I had a few seams in it. We put some blocks underneath to screw it all together. You want to silicone any gaps so the concrete doesn't leak through. And because the concrete is going to be a total of 2 1/4 inches out here, minus the 1/2 inch that's going to stay, it'll be 1 3/4 inches thick on top. I went ahead and relieved this edge with a slight chamfer for this smaller drop down section. It's only going to be 1 inch of drop down, and if you know anything about concrete, we know that it always cracks out on the outside corner. So not a bad idea just to roll this edge if you have a situation where you have a smaller section of poured concrete. So now we're forming the edge of the form, and I just took some MDF 1x4. I ripped it down on the table saw because I've got a little too tight of a radius here. If it was just this, sometimes you don't have to rip it down. You just have to kind of test your piece. And I'll do multiple layers. And at first I'm just pinning it into the edge, and then later we'll screw it in to give it some more strength. So now the important part is to make sure that the bottom of your vertical piece is flush to the bottom of your melamine form as you work it around. And just keep going. So the vertical parts of the forms are installed. If you come in closer, you can see what I did was did 3 layers of 1/4 inch to bend around and tack them in. Now I'm going around with some 1.5 inch screws, 3 drills, and tightening up the form. On the straightaways, I added some strong backs. You can never have too much bracing. You don't want to have to start doing this when you're pouring the concrete. Stuff starts to bow. So the corners a little more supported, and the next step will be to silicone. Close with our concrete countertop form. You can see what I've done here is I've taken number 3 rebar and made a grid. A lot of countertops, when you use high strength concrete with polymer, it's not necessary, but because we have this floating 1-foot overhang, not a bad idea to put some reinforcement in. Number 3 is nice and easy. You can hand bend it to the shape you want. Ties together really nice. So one more little trick feature we're going to do with our form is when the countertop is poured and we strip the forms, I want to create a little channel for an LED light strip to light up the bottom of the island. It's just kind of a neat lighting feature. So I took the rip actually from the MDF. It's a 1/2 by 1/2 piece, and I'm just going to staple it down to the melamine, the part of the form that we are going to strip off the bottom. So this will come with the melamine form, and we're not nailing it to the plywood, we're just nailing it against the plywood, probably about every 6 inches. Now, for one of the finishing touches, we are going to silicone the edge of the vertical form and the horizontal form, and just a nice small bead of radius. It's going to keep the mud from flowing through the cracks, and it's also going to give us a small radius. I recommend clear silicone. If you use a color, chances are when you peel it off that some of the silicone is going to stick to the concrete and you'll see the color on your concrete. We're going to use black concrete here, so you definitely want to use a clear substance. I'm also going to caulk against the little relief I put in for the LED light. That'll keep the mud from bleeding under here and help release. It's a nice small bead, and then we can go back and finger it just to make a nice seal.
Okay.
Now when we get to the corners, I'm also going to put a nice generous bead. I'll finger in right up the side there. I'll work that in as well. If you see any other little cracks in your form, go ahead and just apply silicone to them as well. There we go. Renting a cement mixer, making faster work. You just got regular old countertop mix, a Quickcrete. Throwing 3 bags in, and we'll add some color and some additive to the mix. There we go. We're starting to pour the concrete. I've got my A-team crew on it. The steady hand girls are just screeding it off. We're about 6 bags into it right now, and they're working the cement.
It'll save you a lot of work.
So we're just, we've decided to edge in a radius on the top. Sometimes you can leave it and do it with a grinder, but Eric, my expert, says we'll tool this one in, take the ridge off with a grinder later. Hi there, we've stripped the forms and everything looks good. I just took some of this rapid set, mix some, we've got some dark dye in here, mixed up a slurry of it, and now we're just pushing it into all the little voids. We'll let it dry. And you want to come in this angle? Okay, so you can see some of the little voids in the concrete here. Come close up, and we just work the slurry into the edges that we will polish off later. We've stripped the forms and then we put the fill in the edge to cover the holes. Now we're using our diamond grits, starting at 50 grit, work your way up to about 3,000. I'm just using my 4-inch grinder on the edge and my random orbital at a low speed to start doing the countertop area. It's pretty dusty if you're doing it inside, so what you can do is hit it with some water and start doing the edge.